Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event. My name is Rich. I'm part of the team here at Kaleidoscope and helping to facilitate today's launch. There's a large number of us on today's call, which is fitting for a pretty momentous occasion, the launch of part one of the National Food Strategy. Thank you so much for everyone for joining. We're going to run for the next 75 minutes. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation. The main part of our event today, the main part of our discussion, is going to be an interview between Henry Dimbleby and Sarah Mukherjee, who I think we can have a wave from now. Hello, Sarah. Hello, Henry. And we'll be coming to Henry and Sarah in just a moment. I'll allow Sarah to introduce herself in just a second, but just to say, Henry Dimbleby, the lead author of today's report. You might well know Henry as the co-founder of Leon and the Sustainable Restaurant Association, back in 2013, asked by government to write the School Food Action Plan, and on the back of that, founded the charity Chefs in Schools, as well as wearing a whole range of other hats, which I'm sure Henry will be touching on as we go through. So we're going to hear a lot from Henry. We're going to hear from Sarah as we go through as well. But we'd also love to hear from you. And just to say thank you so much to everyone who has sent in questions ahead of today. We've literally had hundreds of questions. So as I said, we're due to run this event until 2:45, but with 7,000 questions to go through. I hope no one minds if we extend to like Monday. Is that okay? No. Okay, right, we won't do it till Monday. We will finish at 2:45. We will try and get through as many of your questions as we possibly can, but also we'd like to hear from you as we go through today's event. And there's a few different ways you can do that. So you can use the chat feature on Zoom to send us questions and comments as well. Please do so. You can also get in touch over Twitter. That our username is @food_strategy. The hashtag is food strategy, #food strategy. Please do use that to share all comments and questions. And also, as we go through, we'll be asking you some poll questions just to get a bit of a sense about where some of the opinion in our virtual room sits in terms of some of the big questions considered by the food strategy. I think we're going to have our first opening poll now, which hopefully isn't too much of a taxing one. So very simply, in what capacity are you joining us today? I've given you a few options: citizen, MP, civil servant, industry professional, academic, think tank, campaigner, civil servant, NGO, other. So if you wouldn't mind just voting quickly, please. So if you're able to vote, we'll leave this open for the next, shall we say, 7 seconds. We're going to move quite quickly today. So just to see in what capacity you're joining us today, if you could put an answer in there. Thank you very much. We'll close that poll. Thank you, and share those results. So just to see who is with us today. Well, look, a fantastic range, first of all, so thank you for that. Range from civil society, range from industry as well. We have MPs online, we've got citizens, civil servants. In fact, all of these boxes ticked, which is wonderful to see. So thanks all again for joining, and we'll be having a few more poll questions as we go along. So I think that's probably enough from me for now. I will hand over to Sarah. Sarah.
Thanks very much indeed, Rich, and a very warm welcome from Henry and myself. I'm Sarah Mukherjee. I'm Chief Executive of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, or IEMA, and I'm also on the advisory group for the National Food Strategy. Well, of course, as well as binding literally every person in the country, food also binds us into an awful lot of emotion as well. I remember very well the sting of shame when I, as a free school meal kid, got a different colour ticket to everybody else on a Monday for my school lunches. I remember the disappointment when the scales don't head in the right direction. And I remember the fear when you know that the budget for food isn't going to last until the end of the week. And those and many other things we're going to be discussing today. Now, we're going to hear from Henry, as Rich said, in a few minutes with his opening thoughts, and then keep those questions piling in. We'll get through as many as we can in the next 65 minutes or so. But before we hear from Henry, we thought we'd like to share with you a brief animation which sets out some of the big decisions and events that were the starting point for the strategy.
Sometimes the only way to shape a better future is to learn from the past. In 1945, as the Second World War ground to a close, humanity faced an existential threat even greater than the fight against fascism. Despite all the bloodshed, the global population had more than doubled over the previous 150 years. Scientists predicted that over the next century it would rise by much, much more, from 2.5 billion to over 9 billion. There wouldn't be enough land to grow the food required to feed us all. Mass starvation seemed inevitable. But those scientists hadn't factored Norman Borlaug into their equations. The American botanist arrived in Mexico in 1944, hoping to breed more productive types of wheat. He was shocked by the poverty and the hunger of the people. "I don't know what to do," he wrote to his wife, "but we have to do something." Borlaug spent years in the heat-blasted fields, painstakingly tweezering off individual stamen and mingling pollens by hand. The locals thought he was crazy, but his bloody-mindedness paid off. After many years, he managed to create a high-yielding, disease-resistant wheat. Mexico flourished. Scientists repeated the trick for rice and corn, and a new style of intensive farming spread across the world, combining tough breeds of crop with industrial fertilizers, pesticides and herbicides, and improved irrigation. Productivity soared. Billions of lives were saved, but solving one problem often creates others. As these crops became more abundant, we ate more of them. It became easier to manufacture and market cheap products full of the sugar, fat and salt that humans find hard to resist, even when they make us ill. 3 in 10 adults in this country are now obese. Bad diets killed 15% of us. The current pandemic has revealed quite how dangerous the modern diet is. People suffering from obesity are almost 50% more likely to die from COVID-19. And it isn't just our health at stake. As the amount of food being produced from the land increased, wildlife has decreased. In the UK, we have lost half our farmland birds, 97% of our wildflower meadows, and half our ancient woodland. The food sector is also responsible for 20 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. Our food system needs another revolution. The job of the National Food Strategy is to work with citizens to figure out how. This is your chance to help shape a better future. As we emerge from the COVID-19 crisis, how can we build a more resilient and less harmful food system? How concerned are you about where your food comes from and how it is produced? How much are you prepared to change your own eating habits, to improve your health and to protect the environment? What should food companies and governments do to help us make the right choices? How do we make sure everyone can eat well, even in the coming economic crisis? Now is the time to make your voice heard. Help build a food system fit for the next generation.
So Henry, very much the sense of too little and then too much in that film. And I know as the author of this report, it's something that you've really been struggling with and how to get that balance right.
Yes, and in fact, even now, this report that we're publishing, part 1, is very much about that. We see alongside each other the problems that I'm convinced we're going to face of poverty and hunger as we come off furlough, but also the problem of obesity. I think it might be worth just starting by talking a little bit about what it is that we have, that we published today. I was asked when Michael Gove was the Secretary of State at DEFRA to look at the food system, to create a national food strategy. And it was in the context of the agricultural bill, the 25-year environment plan, and people asking rightly, where is food in all of this? We're just talking about the environment, where is food? And my original terms of reference were to give recommendations for government, set out a plan for how we could create a food system that not only produced the amazing numbers of goods that it does at the moment, it really, we have a variety of food, we take for granted a variety of food at prices that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. But to create a system that not only creates affordable food, but does that for anyone, regardless of where they live or how much they own, healthy food, restores the environment. It's been a massive part of the degradation of the environment, our food system, maintains our beautiful countryside, creates jobs, both rural and locally, and stops making us sick, because the slow motion disaster of our diet is going to bring this country down. And then, so I was about to publish an interim report. It was going to be a kind of a sit back examination of the issues in the food system. What are the goods it produces? What are the harms? What are the power dynamics and economics that create those two things? And then COVID struck and turned all of our lives upside down in different ways. In my life, there were kind of three main elements to that. One was obviously in the hospitality industry, seeing a lot of friends closing businesses. My business partner, John, who runs Leon, trying to deal with that. In DEFRA, the team that were working on this strategy were moved, quite rightly, to work on the issues of food vulnerability. So how do we ensure the mainstream system survives? How do we get food to the shielded? How do we get food to people who are otherwise vulnerable financially or logistically? And then I also had 3 kids, as a lot of us did, 3 kids at home, homeschooling, which was a challenge. But what became clear what has become clear throughout the last few months is that COVID was not the great leveler. It's been a very discriminatory virus. It preys on men rather than women, the old rather than the young, the poor rather than the rich. It preys more on Black and Asian people than it does on white. And in particular, it preys on the physically frail. And it's going to leave us, if we're not careful, with what some economists have described as a K-shaped recession. So the downward strike of the K representing those parts of society that have been most hit by the virus, and the upstrike, those who have the resources and still have jobs afterwards, for whom it will be a strange and weird time, but who will actually come out of it very well. And so I decided that I wanted to change what I was going to do in part 1 of the strategy and write something that that dealt with 2 themes. And the first of those 2 themes was, how do we protect our most disadvantaged children from the COVID crisis? And another thing that I've been doing, the charity that I've been doing, Naomi and Nicole, who run Chefs in Schools, which was a charity I helped found, have spent their time getting food parcels to vulnerable families, free school meals families. And I've seen that firsthand, and I have, everyone knows it, but just seeing it, it is striking the difference between those children's lives and the lives of my children, both living in the same postcode, but mine with a garden, Wi-Fi, iPads, spare rooms where different people can do their work. And already those children are, as we know, left behind. But we have, coming up in the autumn, we already have 3.3 million more people on universal credit. The OBR, Office's Budget Responsibility, says that at least 1.6 million people are going to be made redundant as furlough is unwound. And that is going to leave, no matter, universal credit isn't going to be able to cope. Food bank usage is already up. And so the first part of the strategy is, how do we use existing mechanisms of state to try and support those most vulnerable children? So it's not a kind of, the recommendation isn't a grand plan to change the food system. It's a very specific intervention. And I've taken 3 things, free school meals, and recommended that they are available to all children on universal credit. The Healthy Start vouchers, which are given to pregnant women and women on certain levels of parents and carers of women of children up to the age of 4 on certain benefits to buy milk, fruit and vegetables, and suggested that those be ramped up. And then taking the fantastic but quite small holiday activity and food program, which allows disadvantaged children 4 days a week for 4 weeks in the holidays to come into school or sometimes elsewhere, have activities and eat a lunch, that be rolled out to everyone in universal credit, another 1.1 million children. I think that the effects of hunger on a young body are severe and long lasting. They not only give you bad long-term health, they stop you learning, they can damage your mental health. And so I hope that those three things will give, if you are talking about levelling up, the kind of very foundation of, it seems to me, of opportunity, equality of opportunity, is to have a nutritious meal. So that is kind of one set of themes. And then there's another one on there, which is we actually don't know, or at least we know much more now because the government has been monitoring it, but we don't know how bad food insecurity is where, and it's going to be a very changing picture. It's going to change rapidly. The problems will emerge in different areas. So I've recommended the government to continue for the next 12 months actively to monitor that through surveys, through collecting health data, so that if necessary, they can stage other interventions. The second half, the second kind of set of themes is all about the end of the transition period in December the 31st, the end of this year. And there are three recommendations there. And what I have argued is that the sovereignty we have gained from leaving the European Union, kind of the essence of sovereignty is freedom. And it is important that we use that freedom to do the things that we value. And that means that trade deals should be done in terms of food to protect the standards that we have here. That it makes no sense, and I've said this before, it makes no sense to have a high standard of farming here and then simply import food that undercuts that and exports the harms to animals, the harms to the environment elsewhere. And that those deals should have a similar level of scrutiny to all the other mature trade relations. So a confident, newly sovereign Britain should have the confidence to have its deals scrutinized in the same way that Canada does, Australia does, the US does. What's different here about what I've said, the recommendations, is it's quite complicated, the legal and regulatory arguments. And so on the first of those things, the standards, I have set out a mechanism for how we could certify foreign farmers to our standards, and suggested that the newly formed Trade and Agriculture Commission, one of their jobs should be to set out what those core standards are. And those core standards shouldn't be just animal welfare, chlorinated chicken, hormone beef. We should also be thinking about the environment. These deals are going to last for 25 years. And so I don't think we should be importing beef raised on rainforest. And then the final thing, there was going to be a third theme, which was health, because I said, this has shown how frail, this virus has shown how frail we have become. The third biggest risk factor, first biggest risk factor of COVID is being over 70. The second biggest risk factor is having blood cancer. And the third biggest risk factor is being obese or having uncontrolled diabetes. And so that has just shown something which we have a health emergency, and it's amazing we haven't recognized it till now. I put some recommendations on that. The government actually on Monday did the things, not necessarily because I said them, but just happened to do them. So I've left the arguments in there because I think it's much more nuanced than the kind of nanny state versus non-nanny state debate. I thought it was worth having the arguments. So that's kind of part one. Part two will be a much more, hopefully, systematic, far-reaching approach to creating a food system that does protect our environment, makes us well rather than sick, but continues to create jobs and is resistant to climate change. But there is a lot to do now in part one, and I'm hoping the government will take these recommendations and start doing that.
Great, thanks very much, Henry. That's a great, I hate that phrase, but tour d'horizon of that first part of the strategy. I will, if I may, start with some of those COVID questions before we perhaps move on to the questions of health that, as you said, you didn't quite get to this time. We've got a question that's just come in. There's going to be a lot of support for your strategy, but how easy will it be to deliver if we have a second wave of coronavirus?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, if I look at actually the mechanism, those things that I have suggested. So on the poverty side, those are all mechanisms that exist. It's a funding issue largely. There will be, I think that if you did the holiday activity scheme, which I hope they will put more money into it this summer, I don't think you would logistically be able to cover all the 1.1 million children we suggested this summer, but it should be doable. More should be doable, and a healthy start should be doable, as should monitoring the situation. So that is all doable. On trade, I've really put in points of principle. And I think what will happen with the second wave is potentially the trade deals will be pushed back. I don't think it's very likely, to be honest, that we'll get any trade deals this year. It's more, I think that will come over the next 3 years. The government wants to do 80% over the next 3 years. So I'm not too worried that the second wave will affect these recommendations. What it will do is make the problems of poverty and hunger even more serious than they are currently.
And I guess to build on that, another question that we've had in is about, I mean, you mentioned very powerfully how everybody worked very quickly to get the food system functioning again during COVID-19. But how do we get those positive responses? The question is asking, not just for a few weeks, but for the long term.
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing watching this from behind the scenes. So you had the stockpiling started around the end of the first week, second week of May, and then on the 21st of May, Saturday the 21st of May, George Eustice, in a press conference, Secretary of State, was forced to deny that we needed rationing of fruit and vegetables, because the clamour had become so large from some sides saying we're going to have rationing. There was an article in the Telegraph saying it's inevitable that we have rationing. And then on Monday, the Prime Minister said, so that's the 23rd, the Prime Minister said, do not go to restaurants, stay at home. Didn't make it illegal, just said don't go. And then on the Friday, we had lockdown. And so the retail business that was already dealing with a surge as large as Christmas, that normally it has all year to prepare for, suddenly had 20 to 25% of the calories that we eat from the out-of-home sector come into retail. And, you know, we saw all of those issues. We saw the fact that flour for out-of-home is made in huge bags and you can't bag it in small bags. And we'd all started home baking. And there were all these things that happened. And there were lots of, every day, we had this 8:15 conference call, every day there were worries, you know, were they going to close the short straits? Were they going to stop drivers traveling from Spain? But it never happened. And actually the food system, the private sector has been really actually responded very well to this crisis. The problem is, I think, that is the responses to what we need in the future, which is the climate change crisis, the health crisis. I think those are things that the food sector can't solve on its own. But it was, you know, the due credit to Tim, who I've seen is on the line, always says, you know, the leave it to Tesco's approach is irresponsible. But Tesco's and the supermarkets did actually do, in this instance, a pretty good job of ensuring that the mainstream food supply did not fall over.
But in a way, it did, and you're quite right to say it did shine a spotlight on a lot of inequality as well. I mean, if you couldn't get to a supermarket to get affordable fruit and vegetables before, you certainly couldn't during lockdown. That there are some people for whom the outcomes of COVID are dependent on the sort of food they're managing to get to eat. If you're sharing accommodation with a single microwave, you can't cook yourself a healthy broth because you don't have the ability to do it. So, I mean, you know, obviously you can't fix everything with a single strategy, but do you think that there's a chance that the sort of collective will that we've had, which I guess is the questioner's real question, are we going to manage to maintain that momentum?
I think we need to. So I think that if you look at, you know, your thing about difference, at the start, at the outset, about 8 million people said they were struggling to find food. And that was people who just couldn't get into the supermarket because the queues were too long. Convenience stores in rural areas suffered there. So they weren't full initially and it took a while to get the food out there. So people were having to travel into town or ask friends to travel into town. Quite quickly, after about a couple of weeks, that went down to about 4 million. But there are still people, it's still logistically, you know, there are only so many delivery slots for supermarkets, a small part of the market. There are still people who, for logistical, not financial reasons, are finding it hard to get food. In terms of the will question, I don't think that any other outcome is imaginable. this is a problem that we have to solve, and the problem of food supply we have to solve before climate change gets too bad. And I do sense that there is movement. So, today I got texts and messages from people who in the past might have said we don't have these issues, and in particular those issues are food poverty, climate change, health related. Just leave it to the market, it's going to be fine. And I do sense that people, having seen, the government has intervened in the market in a way that unprecedented, realize that actually maybe the government can be a force for good, and businesses who think, well, maybe I can be a force for good independent. I'm not just going to be commercial. I do have a sense of purpose. Those businesses, the people on that call at, people say, oh, the supermarkets are gaining a share. The logistics guys, the people from those supermarkets, all they cared about, you could tell, all they cared about was making sure we got enough food in to people. It wasn't about money. And I think that we have had maybe a kind of teachable moment, that sense of purpose, those people working together, having cut each other's throats to get a can of beans 1p cheaper for the last 20 years, might think, well, maybe we work together now so we can work together in the future to create a better food system for our children.
And I guess it's also changed the whole way that we as the general public view food services as well. I mean, as shop workers are celebrated as key workers who have really made a huge difference to the national effort. Before we move on to the next section and maybe go to Rich for another poll, you have had some retailers who've expressed in principle support. I think Waitrose and the Co-op. I mean, are you hoping that others will join? Yeah,
so this was, there's a long way to go, but what I had suggested to the supermarkets is that the Healthy Start voucher, that the government increases the value of it from £3.10 to £4.25, which is spent on milk, fruit and vegetables, which if you read Daisy Stemple's testimony in the report, sounds like not a lot of money. It's vital support to get fresh vegetables into those children. The supermarkets, all of them actually pretty much are quite keen to get involved. Some of them are worried about the mechanism, but I am pretty confident that we can get supermarkets to supplement free fruit and vegetables in addition to what the government does. Because that really is, if you can get young children and pregnant mothers who are in the most disadvantaged segments of society, if you can get them eating more fruit and veg, that kind of is the most direct support you could give in terms of the food system to people for their diets.
Thanks, Henry. So, Rich, I think maybe time for the first of our main subject polls.
Lovely. So, Henry, thank you very much indeed. And thanks again, everyone, for sharing comments, questions, whether that's via Twitter or on the chat facility. Great to see the debate raging. Yes, our first subject poll question, which we're going to launch now, please, is all about the impact of COVID. So we're giving you a statement asking you to say how much you agree or disagree with that. Undoubtedly, the food system has experienced a shock with COVID. I am confident it will build back better. Do you strongly agree with that? Do you strongly disagree? Or somewhere in between? We will give you approximately 6.5 seconds to consider a nuanced response to a complex question. So if you can give us your view there. Thank you to all the hundreds who are doing so. Thank you very much. We'll close that in just a couple of seconds. So the food system has experienced a shock, undoubtedly, with COVID. Are you confident it will build back better? Strongly agree to strongly disagree? Thank you. We'll close that poll now. Thank you, and share those results. So again, 44% agreeing, 6% strongly agree. So it's actually 50% agreeing or strongly agreeing, 24% neutral, 23% disagree, 3% strongly disagree. Sarah, back to you and Henry for reaction.
Thanks very much. Henry, does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't actually. I mean, I swing between agree and disagree all the time. I mean, sometimes at night, I think it looks pretty bleak, particularly when I look at the hospitality sector and I see all the people who are going to be out of work, and I think it's all just going to be about price. And but then other times, I do think we've learned a lesson, and it's quite a big deal that. And it happened with school food, actually, with when universal infant free school meals came in. That was a coalition government, but The Tories supported it as well. And I do think that there has been a shift at the kind of Overton window of politics where the importance of the state to guide the market, and I write about this in the report and how historically we haven't really thought about it enough, is kind of recognised across the political spectrum. And that does give me hope. That fact does give me hope. I think that there is a recognition of the problems and the need to do something about it.
That's a good point, actually, because Denise, sorry, I'm pointing at the screen because I can see the questions up here. If more children are eligible for free school meals, how do we ensure that schools provide healthy, tasty and nutritious food? That's a really good question.
It's a very, very difficult thing to do. So, I mean, the school food plan was all about this. And what we noticed was that we visited over 60 schools, and the schools that were doing really amazing things had a few things in common. It wasn't whether they were authority run or academies. It wasn't whether it was in-house or out of house. They all had strong leaders who believed that this was important. They all treated, had a whole school approach. So the food wasn't just in the dining room, it was part of the whole school. And they all took into account what the child wanted. So they really cared about what the food tasted like, the atmosphere in the dining room. You know, the teachers all ate with them. And so I think we changed the school food standards at the time, and cooking came on the curriculum at the time. But I think school food standards keep the worst out, but they don't encourage the best. At the moment, even though it is a legal responsibility, and it's a good curriculum, go and have a look at it if you want. People aren't doing it. So the question is, you can't send in the army to do it. You can't pass a law to do it. And I think there needs to be, it's a combination of creating a culture, making sure it's funded, making it much more central to the purpose of society. But it is that I'm going to do much more on that in part 2, because it's very interesting, having tried to do it and then gone back 7 years later, and things are much better in schools now than they were 7 years ago. Jamie Oliver kind of made us realize how bad it was. We were in willful blindness before he came along, and they have been getting better and better, but there are still schools I go to and you just look at a range of beige foods and it breaks your heart. So there's work to do. So I don't know all the answers, but I want to do more on that.
But the point you make about learning how to cook in schools, if you lose that kind of golden thread, and I often think actually that communities of different heritage, Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities could actually support with that for years. I mean, I remember going down to North London when I was little because it was the only place you could get an aubergine, and we lived in Cambridge. And to go on the bus to get an aubergine. But to a certain extent, cooking had to stay within the household because you couldn't buy what you wanted outside. And yet we never seem to have leveraged that in terms of making sure that kids learn how to cook and it's part of their school experience as well.
There's definitely a whole generation who can't cook, and that is a problem even for people who have money, because, you know, I point out in the report, everyone thinks it's a problem with the poor. 20% of everyone is obese. It's just slightly more in less affluent people. And then you layer over that all of the problems that come from being poor, the stress, the lack of equipment, the lack of time. And it does get difficult. There's kind of one of the central debates around is like, it is actually theoretically, you can buy cheap food that is as cheap as ready meals. And actually a policy wonk friend of mine sent me a long description I put in the report about, I've been to Asda, it's this and that, and their cheapest pizza is 70p, and I can get this, what's the problem? And I put next to that Daisy Stemple, this Citizens on the Rise panel, and both of those stories were true. Yeah. They were both true. And I think it's so complicated, that education, culture change, but we have to do it. And, you know, one of the reasons I draw comfort from the Norman Borlaug story and that story is that when we set our minds to things, we can do them. And I don't think society as a whole has really, you know, food, it was a bit of a problem, but actually was it really a problem, and couldn't people eat what they want? And I think that people don't think that anymore, and that gives me hope.
Yes, I mean, the way that we could come together on a vaccine, for example, in a way that was unimaginable
Yeah.
even, can't say that, why can I not say that? But that's a weird word not to be able to say in 6 months. But the point you raise about food and price, I mean, we've had another question. One of my biggest concerns is that food prices are not fair or equal. The less money you have, the more you pay. And we were talking about small convenience stores.
Yeah.
And if that's your only access. And I thought it was interesting, your policy wonk friend, he mentioned a supermarket.
Yeah, Asda and things,
yeah,
not
exactly.
convenience stores. And also, he mentioned one drumstick and this and that, but it's always sold in multi-buys.
Exactly.
So I don't know the answer to that. So I think the central tension in the food system for me, like this, the problem that we have to solve next time is you have a food system that already has a lot of negative externalities. It harms the environment, it pollutes our water, it releases greenhouse gases, it makes us sick, it causes NHS bills. And the theory is that you should put those costs onto the price of food. And then people say, well, hold on, are you saying food should be more expensive? And that is the kind of central tension. I actually think in a number of cases, it doesn't mean that. So if you look at the sugar tax, for example, it didn't make it more expensive, just means people reformulated. But that is this kind of central dilemma of part two that I need to solve in part two.
Yeah, and indeed, a question's just come up on exactly that. Cheap food is vital for many. I mean,
Yes.
Absolutely, being able to buy a chicken that has been raised to a good level of welfare because it's been raised in this country, but to be able to buy it for £3 means you can feed the family with a high protein meal and maybe have some left over for lunch. It's in an ideal world, we'd all love to be able to pay £10 or £15 for the same thing,
Yeah.
but we can't.
But also, cheap food. So our food is, again, that policy wonk friend. It is possible if you don't have all of these other problems about being poor. It is possible to eat pretty reasonably, without spending very much in this country. But it is very difficult for the reasons we described, if you have very little money. I think fundamentally, there has to be some sticks in the ground. And one line for me is particularly on the environmental side and on the health side. I don't buy that environmental degradation is a viable long-term solution to poverty. That can't be the answer. Cannot be, if you make food more expensive by saving the environment, then we've got to find a better way to solve that problem. And again, that is for part two, but that is kind of, that whole cheap food, expensive food. We need to find a way of moving. I need to find another way of tackling that debate.
Totally reframing it a
Yeah.
little bit. Yeah. One more specific question, would it be helpful to give guidance on what types of high fats are good for us? Or do you advocate the ban on the sale of nuts, fish oils, avocados, instead of mentioning the link between high carbohydrates, obesity and type 2 diabetes?
So in the plan, I didn't recommend the ban of anything. I do think that the advertising, although a clumsy instrument, you can't advertise cheese before 9 p.m, which is a sadness. Although a clumsy implement, I am convinced that removing most of that advertising is not for cheese. It's for junk food.
Exactly, yeah.
And cheese is, it's an observer at a drive-by shooting who happened to get hit by a ricochet.
Yeah.
But
it's also quite expensive, to be fair, as well.
But so I do think that recommendation is powerful and should be done. What this question hints at is, I actually had quite a lot of stuff in this on the science behind food, on ultra-processed food and the developing science there. And I do think that we need to, if we're going to take this seriously, we need to take the science more seriously, and we need to invest more in understanding. Because at the moment, all of these fringe debates are being had on Twitter, and there's a very small number of people working incredibly hard, and I've worked with them, Alison Tedston, Susan Jebb, etc. But we need to spend more money in understanding exactly what it is about the food that's making us sick.
And a key point of this, as you're alluding to, is health as well. Now I'm sure you've got GP friends, I have as well, who say, they sometimes quite deliberately, they've got 10 minutes. They skirt round the issue of the weight of their patients, because it's a very complex issue. How do you unpack it? What are the resources? There aren't that many, or obviously there'll be more now the obesity strategy has been launched. But do you think that they're kind of, I know we've had Jonathan Falabji on the advisory group, but do you think that health is perhaps, or GPs are the bit that are not being addressed?
I think you need to have, I mean, I think GPs could be supported and trained more to do it. I think that you have to be careful of discrimination, but I know in my life, I say in the report that my weight has gone from the high end of normal to the low end of obese, and I have been to the doctor, and the doctor has said, you should lose some weight, and it was awkward and slightly embarrassing, and I felt slightly irritated with him at the time. But actually, as I walked back from the doctor, it just forced me to think about it. And so I think that we need to be acting on the system in so many different ways, but giving I got GP friends who are all texting me today. They all say they got almost no training on nutrition. That's not what they do. Most of their stuff, most of their work, as we know, is mental health, and that's important. But this is linked also to kind of mental. I know my weight is much more when I'm stressed or doing it kind of goes. So I do think that they need more support, and they could make better interventions.
And that link between emotion, as you quite rightly identified, and I think you do that really powerfully in the report as well. I've the same position as you. I've been told I need to lose some weight, quite rightly so, by the doctor, but then a stressful day comes and there's a packet of biscuits in the house, and it's those sort of micro interventions. And it's back to this point that you're saying about how much should you be responsible for your own diet, and how much should the state be supporting you in that journey?
Yeah, and I think that the answer, I think that is again a false dichotomy. So, for me, I think we're going to ask it as a question later, but for me, in the report, David Halpin, who's the head of the Nudge unit, they use a model which is, the individual, social, and material. So all these things affect your choices, your individual personality, the culture, and we have a pretty rotten food culture in this country, and the material environment. And clearly, the government cannot affect all of those things. It can do some on the material stuff. It maybe could do some on the social stuff. And it's pretty lousy at doing stuff on the individual stuff. So I think, there needs to be a balance.
Before we go to Rich for another of that questions, which you beautifully highlighted, Henry, would Henry favour a levy on, for example, ultra-processed foods? You've just mentioned those, or greater taxes on certain food businesses, or some other mechanism?
So part of part two, so what I want to do for part two, I talk in the strategy about some length about the relationship between the citizen and the state. And I think what is clear about what the Prime Minister launched on Monday is that there was very, very clear public desire for it. All the opinion polls show we're fed up of having this stuff marketed at us. And therefore, it wasn't particularly controversial. It didn't impede in my life in a way that I would be upset by. But I think we need to do more. And I want to try and create that strategy with citizens. And part of the input in that is I'm going to commission some work on taxes. It's not just ultra processed, it's salt, etc., to see what kind of effects you might have, and then talk to citizens about, okay, here are the various interventions we could have as a suite. Which are the ones that upset you? Which do you want, and so forth. I know from talking to people all over the country that I always do a vox pop of questions. One of the questions I ask is, would you like to see sweets put in plain packaging? And I must have asked that question to 600 people, and one person who was a vigorous health campaigner said yes, and everyone else was like, my God, that's going too far. So I think you have to be careful that you have to do the interventions which not only are powerful, but also go with the grain of what the citizens want.
Yes, because once you build resistance in one area, that could quite easily bleed over into another.
And citizens do want this, right? So they constantly say, I don't want to be forced. Because, on trade, the free traders say, well, why can't you just label it and people can decide? And time after time after time again, people in surveys say, my life is complicated enough without having to look at the packet to see exactly how this chicken was reared. or how health is. I want someone to do that job for me, thank you very much. And so I think there is quite a lot of acceptance of how you might help them make those decisions easier, but you just need to bring them with you on that. That needs to be a contract that you create together.
Yeah, I mean, we're overwhelmed with choice in almost everything. You're right, and yeah, we know this far better than I do. But the amount of minutes that we all wish to spend in the supermarket is as little as possible. Basically, as you said, there's the odd person you see poring over the labels, but most of us are not that person.
Yeah.
Cool. Rich, shall we go over to our next poll question, and then we'll move on to the trade issues that we've been just talking about.
Sarah, thank you very much. Our next poll question is not, would you like to see sweets in a plain paper bag? That's a question which you can only be asked in person by Henry Dimbleby. So if Henry appears on your doorstep, you know what he's going to say. Our poll is slightly different. It possibly is deceptively simple. Again, a statement. It is my responsibility to eat a healthy diet. Strongly agree through to strongly disagree. It's my responsibility to eat a healthy diet. Thank you very much. We'll give you just a few more seconds for this one. Just to say, so all comments and questions coming through, thank you so much again for doing so. There will be something following today which sort of brings together a whole range of comments from today's event. So do watch out for that. We'll close that poll now, please. Thank you. And we'll see those results. We have, so 80% combined, strongly agreeing or agree. So strongly agree, 43%, agree 37%, neutral 13%, and a combined 8% for disagree, and strongly disagree, just 1% for strongly disagree. Sarah, Henry, back to you for what that means.
It's interesting that, because disagree could mean two things there. So I could strongly disagree, because I could say, I am so bombarded. The environment is so obesogenic that it's impossible. I can't be responsible. But there's another possible reason for answering that, which is I can eat what I want, and it's not my responsibility to eat healthily. It's my decision. So it's kind of interesting. What is true, I think, is that I definitely believe that you cannot. Any interventional system you have that tries to take that responsibility away from you, have to try and empower people. And so while I think that education and that kind of thing is important, and great, and information, empowering people, and I think that has to be most of the answer, because as soon as you're treating people as, I don't like a state that treats its citizens as kind of passive things that it can control. But I just think we need quite a lot of help, and the food system doesn't give us the help that it could give us at the moment.
Well, I mean, we're not short of information, are we? To be fair, on
no.
I mean, I think everybody knows what you need to do, but we're just all, and myself included, collectively failing to do it at the moment. It's interesting you mention a very kind of command and control way. You do talk about Finland in the report, and that's an example of where the government took really quite a robust stance, didn't it, about what it was going to do?
Yeah, but interestingly, so that was actually work that I did when I was back in 2013 on the school food plan. I spoke to Pekka Paska, who was first a young doctor who was sent out to North Kareliä in the northeast of Finland, who to see if they had the worst coronary heart disease rates in the world and the shortest male life expectancy in the developed world. And I talked to him about how they did it, and it was a very, very intense campaign, but a lot of it was voluntary. So they did everything. So they said, we can't work out, we can't do double-blind trials, we can't wait to work out, we just got to do everything and see what happens. And they already had universal free school meals, but they completely changed the meals. That was compulsory. They gave snowshoes to elderly people. They lit ski paths. By negotiation, they persuaded all of the sausage manufacturers all the people selling sausages into that area to reduce the salt levels. They had a TV show that the villages competed with each other to become healthier, which was the second most watched TV show amongst Finnish males at the time. And so there was actually quite and then that became part of Finnish culture. It was rolled out, and there was quite a sense of national kind of national urgency about it. This is embarrassing that we have this rate of coronary heart disease, and now the male life expectancy has gone up by 7 years, more than across other countries in Europe, and they've kind of changed things. And I kind of, with our cynical kind of English way, that part of you goes, oh, that's never going to work here. But at the same time, maybe this crisis has taught us that we do need to have, get a bit excited about things, get excited about changing things, because it's important.
Yeah, and there are parallels, aren't there? I mean, if you look at some of the work that some of the big utility companies have done on energy saving and carbon reduction, you can turn even the most kind of, whatever kind of person, once they realise the benefits and they can see the benefits and reduce costs of bills, into real ambassadors for switching off lights. And I remember talking when I was at the BBC to someone who she'd gone from really cynical about it to being the person who told everybody to walk if they could and switch off the lights and reduce and recycle, and it becomes part of your culture, your life.
Well, I would love to. I mean, there was something that we tried to do with the School for Planet, didn't quite come off. Now, Guy's and St Thomas's are trying to do something similar down in Lambeth and Southwark, led by Sarah Hickey. But I really like the idea of taking an area, or maybe a couple of areas, whether it's in Grimsby or Thanet or wherever it is, but somewhere there are high levels of obesity, high levels of deprivation, high levels of diet-related disease, and say, let's not mess about. Let's have a list of every hospital, every GP, every shop, and let's have a list of actions, and let's see if we can transform this area and see if that changes, that measurably changes things. But you would need, and maybe we have that now, I think in order to do that, you'd need a prime minister, someone with that level of power to bring those people together. But I do think you could get people quite excited about that if you did it in the right way, and it didn't feel like they were being posed upon. They'd asked, you could get people to compete for it or something.
Agreed. Yeah. Oh, interesting. You heard it here first. I'd like to move on from the certain type of competition to another type about trade, which I know is the more nuanced bit of the strategy, the first part. And we've had a question here from Lucy on Twitter. Are the trade recommendations fit for purpose? Real concerns about the dual tariff system's ability to safeguard the environment and nature-friendly farming?
I hope so. Obviously, they were intended to be. I mean, so what the line of argument that I sketch out in the trade chapter, it starts with the fact that there are already countries, not least the EU, who farm to lower standards than us. So, for example, they're allowed to stock chickens to 42 kilometers per square meter. We're 39. They're still allowed to use sow stalls. We're not. Other countries outside the EU are allowed to use neonics, and we're not. And so if you were to have, as Neil Parish, in one of the 300 or so amendments that was put to bill, so I'm not singling out Neil,
the
agriculture bill, he said, in order to import food, you have to meet our standards. And that would have meant not doing a free trade deal with the EU. And I don't think that level of absolutism is worth it. So the first and trade is all about compromise. The first compromise I made is said, okay, let's not be absolutist about it. Let's define a core set of standards so that if we're trying to create a trade deal with a country that has very different standards, America might be one, we have a core set of standards where we don't want to let food in that it doesn't meet our standards. And I said that as I said before, the Trade and Agriculture Commission should define those standards. And I said that those should not, in my view, they shouldn't just be animal welfare, they should be environmental as well. So that's the first compromise. The second compromise, which is, I think, the thing that's being referred to here, is why don't you simply ban things outside of that group rather than having the dual trade? So people say, well, if you have dual tariff, what will happen is over time when no one's looking, unlike in Australia and Canada and New Zealand, tariffs are not statutory, so the government can change them. They say, oh, well, it's just going to come down, and that stuff's going to leak in. And the reason that I didn't do that was that there is a long-standing convention that you don't keep things out through bans, you keep them out through high tariffs. And I was convinced that actually doing a ban on that basis would be unlikely to be viable, and that's why I did it. There is a risk. I actually think on this, people talk about how confident are you of this. I think that the public appetite for letting that stuff into our country is so low. It's up there with plain packaging on sweets as the thing people, whether you're in, the urban centre of Leeds or you are in the countryside in Devon, we as a country care very, very much about the quality of our food. So I'm actually less worried about that. I think it'll be okay, but that's definitely that is a concern. But bad stuff can happen. Even if good stuff happens now, bad stuff can happen in the future.
Yeah, and if it really came to it, I mean, if you had those, box of chicken wings or whatever from wherever at 99p, and you could feed the family for quite a while on that if you've got the cooking facilities. I mean, we're quite price sensitive. We could argue we're some of the most price sensitive shoppers in Europe in terms of actually when the price is low enough.
Although interestingly, on the meat front, almost all the major supermarkets only stock British chicken and beef, unless it's a special thing. Yeah. And actually, most of that stuff comes in through out of home. So the cheap beef and the chicken is mostly being sold in out of home, which is a whole other issue about out of home versus retail, which we may or may not come on to.
Yes, definitely. But there's a really good punchy question here, which I have to ask you. Is the next food crisis going to happen on the 1st of January 2021?
I actually don't think so. So in DEFRA, I saw that I'm non-exec, so I wasn't responsible in any way, but I saw the very detailed preparation for before COVID, a no deal. And there were some big concerns there, wiping out the lamb market. Uphill farming was particularly, if a lot of that gets sold to Europe, suddenly have a massive tariff, it's all going to go. But compared to what we have done, it was like a kind of not even a warm-up for what's happened in the last 3 months, trying to save, in farming, dairy, and then beef, because they both got hit by the out-of-home. In fact, people weren't having cappuccinos, or potatoes, people were eating chips, the whole wiping out of hospitality, So the measures that have been put into place dwarf what was being planned for Brexit. And I cannot imagine, if you look at the change in prices from Brexit, there are some sectors, such as uphill sheep farming, which would be badly affected. But I cannot imagine the amounts of money to make sure those don't fall down are small. And I can't imagine that this government, in the midst of everything else, would want to be seen to have that on its hand. Clearly, if COVID had happened as a result of, if what we're seeing now in the economy happened as a result of government intervention, we would have had a coup by now. The government would have fallen. But they wouldn't want it to happen because of their actions. So I'm actually, having seen closely what's happened, I'm much less worried about no deal than I was. I still don't think it'd be great, to be honest. I also happen to think, and I happen to think it is so bad, both in total for the farmers in the European Union and in the small and price rises for us, that I cannot see that even if on day one you have a standoff, that wouldn't get fixed. Because what are they going to do with the food? They're not suddenly going to find other markets. So all that food is going to sit there. So I'm less worried about that issue of Brexit than I am about the trade deals, because the trade deals last for 25 years.
I will pick up on that question you raised about the restaurant trade as you brought it up. As you said, there was a massive change in the percentage of calories that we got. Went from outside and inside to completely inside the home. And a lot of the poverty that we're talking about is potentially from people whose businesses may never start again, or who were working in businesses that will be vastly reduced. And you've got obviously quite painful personal experience with Leon. Do you think that, well, firstly, do you think that the restaurant trade will ever get back to where it was? And secondly, there were a lot of tunes that government could play through advice and information, through publicly available food chains and in restaurants. Is that a string that has maybe been pulled away in one of the tools in the box that the government has in order to get us to think about eating more healthily?
So I'm going to come back and ask you to clarify the second question.
Yeah.
But the first question is, I mean, hospitality is a really peculiar sector. It's extraordinarily entrepreneurial. It's quite, it's proper animal spirits, and it will grow up. Like the first plants that returned to Chernobyl, hospitality would re-emerge, and I'm sure that it will be in time very strong, and it will come back strong. The question is, can you, if there's going to be this massive dip, there's a lot of evidence that shows that if you don't get a first job, or if you lose a first job, that is a real problem for life. Yeah. And so the question for me is, can we just keep those businesses going? Because restaurants aren't profitable if they're 10%. They have to be very busy to be profitable. The question is, can you keep them going? Yeah. To stop all those lives going on hold? That's the big issue for me. People will be eating out. It's kind of fundamental to human nature. But I think it would be a tragedy if it had to fall away completely and then rebuild for the lives of those people who are currently working in it.
And we will go to our final poll in a minute, but just to clarify that last bit, I mean, for example, now if you go into Starbucks, there's a calorie counter next to each of your drinks. I mean, those sort of tools that the government have with 25% of our calories to ask restaurants.
Yes, I see, right, yes.
Yeah, has that actually been taken away? Is that one less tool that the government has?
Oh, I see. I don't know, really. It's interesting. I mean, I was very against initially the idea of calorie counting in restaurants because I thought it was fun. I didn't want to shove down my throat. But I now think that it is so many, or used to be so many of our calories, isn't anymore, that it's fair enough. It's relatively easy to do, and you can put it on in a stylish way as a chain. But in terms of government's control, I don't really know. I think more for me, the problem is that you actually have an imbalance of regulation on the other side. So food companies are regulated much, much more than restaurants. Is there a way that you can level the playing field without creating? The difference is that restaurants are mostly tiny, individual businesses, very fragmented. So is there a way that you can remove the worst that's going on in the restaurant sector, level the playing field without introducing regulation that's so bureaucratic it kills it?
Thanks very much, Henry. So Rich, our final poll question.
Thank you very much. Yes, poll 4 for today, which is a question about trade. We'll come to it in just one moment. There we go. So a statement once more. So interested in your view, please, all 1,000 of you who are joining. So the UK should maintain high food standards, even if it means we sign fewer trade deals. Strongly agree to strongly disagree. We'll give you a clutch of seconds just to reply to that. Whilst you do, just say thank you again for everyone who sent through questions, either ahead of our session or during our session live today. We're on the home straight. We've got about a dozen minutes left or so. We won't be able to answer all questions, but we'll make sure that we do find some way to come back with responses to the whole raft which will come through. But for this poll question, we'll close that now, please, and share the results. Well, I think that is fairly conclusive. 64% strongly agree, 29% agree, so that's 93% agree or strongly agree. Neutral disagree, strongly disagree. If you're in the strongly disagree camp, consider yourself an independent thinker, so have a pat on the back for that. But strongly agree and agree very much in the lead there. Sarah, back to you.
Thank you very much.
I think on that strongly disagree thing, I tried in the trade chapter, I spoke to Liz Truss and I spoke to Crawford Faulkner, and I do buy the argument that this kind of protectionism has in the past been used, and I clearly spell out the good that free trade deals do, and I think you have to be wary of protectionism. But I just think that in this case, the environmental in particular pressures and the animal welfare pressures are so great that we have to take a stand. We have to, there's literally no point in leaving one trading block just to sign ourselves up to the standards of another trading block.
Thank you. I do, as Rich said, we've got a few minutes left, and I do want to use those to maybe address some of the next steps questions that we've had. And there's a couple here around who's the cabinet minister that's going to champion this? Do we need a food minister? I guess, the question is, who is going to be the government face of actually actioning this? So
at the moment, there are a few government ministers who have been very supportive. So in particular, George Eustace, Matt Hancock, and Michael Gove all care about these issues a lot. And that's not saying the others don't, it's just those are the people that I've engaged with quite a lot. I also think that now number 10 seems to go that way. In the obesity strategy announcement on Monday, they explicitly asked me to look at procurement policy, which I was really pleased. I mean, I was going to do it anyway, but it was very nice to be asked. But I'm an independent reviewer, and part of my job is to try and create momentum so that it's easy for them to recommend, so to build a broad consensus. And, as an independent reviewer, you're always aware that if you don't get that right, you might work very hard on something and it just withers away. So I'm constantly thinking, I'm not doing this for fun, and I'm constantly thinking, how can I make sure that as much of this gets implemented as possible? On the structures, do we need a minister for food? That is something, the structures of government around food, and do they need to be changed? That's one of the things I'll be recommending on in part 2.
Fantastic. A couple of questions here from businesses. I mean, how will this better the strategy be taken forward? And also, what level of support from business leaders do you need to make this a reality? So
this bit of the final bit of the strategy, the government have said that they will respond to with a white paper within 6 months. This bit of the strategy wasn't meant to have recommendations, so everyone's scratching their heads about what the appropriate response is. I think they're going to write me a letter. But what would be helpful is, I hope in the trade chapter, what I tried to do was write something, the level of, it was quite, anything you read was quite hard to get your head around. It was quite difficult. So I've tried to write sort of a manifesto there. So we're actually going to put the trade chapter, various chapters as PDFs on their own. So anyone here who thinks I've got the recommendation right, spreading the word, sending them to Tory MPs, sending them to Labour MPs who might care, sending them to the decision makers. Likewise on poverty, that would be absolutely fantastic. In terms of businesses, please sign up for, this is everyone actually, but we want to have a proper conversation discussion. If you go to the website, you can sign up there, write a little note. There's a lot of coverage about a line about Percy Pig in the thing today. It was a kind of small point I was making, and I'm very not anti-business, and I think business needs to be part of the solution. So please do write in, say in particular how you want to work. One of the things we'd love to do, if you think it would be relevant, is to hold some discussions, or to help you hold discussions in your workplaces. We want to engage as many citizens and workers in the food chain in this as we can.
But it is tough, isn't it? I mean, because at the end of the day, you've got a profit to make, as you quite rightly pointed out before. And I mean, we all know, all of those of us have had kids who were, you're tired, you haven't slept since Wednesday, and they're kind of grasping for the sweets. And that's an element of profit that you're asking, essentially, you're asking businesses to give up.
Well, I think that's why quite a lot of businesses calling for regulation. So Roger Whiteside does it, the CEO of Greggs in the report. Independently of that, Mike Coop of Sainsbury's has, Dave Lewis has recently. I think there are elements where creating a level playing field, excluding the worst, stopping the bombarding with advertising will work. But that's only a little part. If you look at those, that's to get rid of some of that, the pressure on the individual. But in the end, quite a lot of it will be businesses working voluntarily with citizens, working voluntarily with schools, like bringing ourselves up, making change that happens from the bottom up, not from the top down.
So you're moving on now to the second part of the strategy, which, as you mentioned, is about the food system and agriculture. Is there anything that you need from the many, many people and hugely influential people watching now to help you with that bit of the work?
Yes, so always ideas and arguments. So I've been incredibly lucky to have access to all sorts of people from different walks of life to test the arguments. But this is basically my job, is I see it as to kind of understand where we're trying to get to and then find the cleverest, most original or any ideas from anywhere and kind of facilitate a debate. And so if you have ideas of how we can create a better system, go to the website, put them up. And then if you want to get involved in the discussion separately, the national conversation, write that as well. But I'm hungry for ideas. No one has yet solved this, right? So people are trying to do this all over the world, in Amsterdam, in Canada, in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in America, and it's a big problem and no one's got the answer, and maybe you do.
Henry, it's been a real pleasure. And we said that this time would just fly by, and indeed it's had. We're almost at the end. I think probably it's worth saying a huge thanks to the team as well, the strategy team, who've done amazing work.
They've done, so they came back at the beginning of July, some of them 2 weeks ago. They have been working night and day. And yeah, absolutely very many thanks to Tamsin and Anna and everyone on the team, and to you today, but also to the 1,000 or so of you who are on this call. Feels like a real privilege getting the chance to share it with you, and please get in touch.
Great, thanks, Henry. Thank you very much. And Rich, I think it's over to you just for the last few minutes and a bit of a wrap up.
Indeed. Henry, thank you once again. And again, just to extend our thanks to everyone who's joined today. I think in most parts of the country, it's a beautiful afternoon. And for you to spend your time with us hearing about strategy is very gracious of you, and we really do appreciate it. Just to reiterate those next steps again, the key web address for you is nationalfoodstrategy.org, and I think there's an ability on there to join the mailing list. So you'll not only hear all about part one, but you'll hear all about that conversation which Henry was referring to, and everything which will be going on as part of part two. So nationalfoodstrategy.org is the place to go to register for more. In terms of what happens next from today's event, we will, as I said, be compiling an output with a whole range of the comments and questions, and we will share that back so that you have a record of our discussions today. But I think it's just left me to say thank you all once again. Thanks for, in whatever way, for playing your part in the development of this strategy, and we look forward to working with you further. Thanks very much, and have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.